Hi, I'm Zack Shirley. I'm the president of the Student Veterans Organization here at Finger Lakes Community College. I'm a U.S. Army veteran with 7 years in service, and I still serve in the U.S. Army Reserves. We've been hearing a lot about mental health in the news and on social media, so we decided it was time to bring in someone to have a conversation with, and today we had the opportunity to speak with Ashley Lewis. She is the Vice President of Operations at Family Counseling Services of the Finger Lakes. She has over a decade of experience helping families and individuals deal with mental health and trauma. We had a really good conversation with her today. Ashley, thank you so much for coming to talk to me and Dom here at FLCC. This is part of a video series that we're doing about different types of mental health aspects. And today we were looking to get some perspective from you and your experience, specifically about trauma. Unpacking and coping and basically how to handle it, not only within yourself, but also maybe for a friend or for people around you. So could you introduce yourself to our audience and say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a real privilege to be able to come speak on a topic that's so important to me and so many others. So I'm Ashley Lewis, Vice President of Operations for Family Counseling Service of the Finger Lakes. I've been in the mental health field for a little over a decade, which is crazy to say. A lot of the work that I've done has been with individuals and survivors of trauma, a multitude of trauma. So excited to be here and talk about that.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So if you want to get us started, Dom, do you want to pass a question to her, or maybe, get a broad scope question like types of trauma that are out there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's really a good question right there, is like what types of trauma, because I know that there's like a wide spectrum of like this whole topic. So what kind of trauma, I guess, would you deal with either the most, and what's the least common, I guess, that you see?
That's a really great question. So I think that trauma is a really big topic. And I think when people think of trauma, they think of an event that happened to someone. But trauma really is our reaction to an event opposed to the event itself. You can categorize trauma in a number of ways, but 3 categories you could really look at would be like acute trauma, like that's more like an isolated event, like a singular event. And then you have chronic trauma. That's when you're experiencing trauma that's ongoing and lasting. An example of that might be child abuse or domestic violence. And then you have complex traumas. That's when an individual is experiencing a multitude of traumas, often at the same time. Each form of trauma impacts an individual, honestly, in a very individualized way. So people experience trauma very differently, regardless of what type of trauma. There's larger contexts of trauma as well. So you have like generational trauma, where trauma has spanned throughout an entire family, from generation to generation. There's also like racial traumas that I don't think are spoken about enough. There's organizational traumas. But I think when people think of trauma, they're really thinking of like interpersonal trauma, that a trauma or an experience that one person has experienced. I hope that answers a little bit of your question.
Yeah,
cool.
For sure. Let's see.
Well, I think, going off of that, when you said that, it's broad spectra to really focused. So like you said, the interpersonal is what we might think of most readily, or a traumatic event. That's very visible, but when you're talking about that generational or the racial, these are things that people might not even recognize as they're happening, either the people that are perpetrating or the people that are affected by it. So how do you guys identify something that might not be easily seen to start treating or start, helping people that are affected by that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. So as you referenced, like maybe people aren't recognizing it as trauma, and you use the examples like racial trauma, organizational trauma, generational trauma. That can also be very applicable to interpersonal trauma. So we're impacted by adversity and traumatic events even before we have memory of that. So I feel strongly when working with any individual, any survivor that's experienced trauma, it's not crucial to label it as such. It's not crucial to treat someone that's experiencing symptoms of trauma, with that diagnosis of PTSD, which we see often, it's really about focusing on stabilization. You don't have to name something to begin to heal from it. There's a lot of research that tells us there's benefit in sharing your narrative and sharing your story, but that's only if an individual is completely in charge of that story and in charge of what, when, and how they share it. So in all of my experience, all my training, my research, one thing I believe wholeheartedly is that an individual does not need to be able to label their trauma, name their trauma to begin that healing process, because the healing starts with authentic, predictable, safe connection with another person. So we can begin healing without being able to name it or recognize it as such.
So what determines what kind of response somebody would have to their trauma?
Yeah, love that question. I think, again, it has to do with what kind of trauma, at what age of development you were at when experiencing the trauma compared to like the relational health. So if we look at 4 typical responses to trauma or traumatic event, we could look at that as fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Often we see the freeze response or that fawning response when the trauma occurred when we were more helpless, so at younger ages, younger parts of development. So the fight, obviously, you're fighting back, you're defending yourself. The flight is like, I'm out of here. When you're a kid and when you're more vulnerable, you don't have those options. You typically can't fight back because, if it's a child abuse situation, the perpetrator is going to overpower. You can't really run because you're dependent on caregivers around you for survival. So freeze is, it could be like a shutdown, a numbing. It could be disassociative, so kind of that separation between our mind and body, like time and space. And then the fawning is one that I think we don't recognize enough or talk about enough, and that is like appeasing. We're appeasing, we're pleasing, we're trying to meet the needs of whoever it is that could cause us harm or cause that trauma. And all of these things can then manifest into other behaviors related to them. So when you brought up addiction earlier, I thought that was really interesting. I love when you said, like, with addiction, you have to, part of that process is like naming that experience. There's a huge correlation, connection between substance use and experienced trauma, because that's very similar to that freeze response. So when we talk about addiction, I heard someone phrase it once like, it's the remedy to something, not the disease itself. So really that numbing is, how do I stay comfortable within my body? And I think that survivors of trauma experience that, and the research would back that up as well.
That's interesting, because like I've heard about, fight, flight, freeze, but I never really heard fawning as much. And I know, Zach, you had said one time, you told me that you had this soldier that was in your was it group that you have that kind of had that response that he talked to you about before.
Yeah, so at my assigned unit, he was brand new to our unit. He was my new team sergeant, and he was always a rock star soldier. He was very high performing, very motivated, very dedicated to work. And I remember like looking up to him. He was in charge of me, and I worked for him. And I thought that he was stellar, always on time, doing the right thing. And I remember down the line when we had new leadership, we had a moment, me and him, where he let me in, and he really had a talk with me that, hey, I can't keep this up. He goes, I'm completely burnt out. He goes, I'm afraid of my evaluations if I slow down my pace, and I'm afraid of them coming back on me, and I never would have thought that something like that was going on with him. I thought he was very well adapted, could cope and handle things well, but now that you mention it, yeah, that is like that fawn response, where they just dump everything into what they're doing to try and please people and avoid more issues,
Yeah. I think that might be related too to like fear of consequence and psychological safety. So that when I think of fawning, I think of Dr. Brene Brown's work, and she references it as the pleasing, performing, and perfecting. if I can manufacture enough control, then I can stay safe. I just have to make sure I do everything perfectly and there's not opportunity for consequence. And if for an individual, I don't know this person obviously, but if they had, previous experienced traumas, then that could be a way of trying to create situations in which no consequence exists. That idea that if we do better, then we will be out of harm's way. Unfortunately, we know that's not always the case, but that definitely could be a response to a traumatic stressor.
So fawning is something that would most likely develop during childhood because that's one of like the only kind of reactions or choices basically that they have. And then that pours out into like their adulthood, like through like most of their adulthood and like other situations that basically they're put in.
Well, let's expand on that a little bit. So we did use children as an example because we know they're more vulnerable. But if you can reflect on other populations that are more vulnerable, then you would see fawning. I think of survivors of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, even some of those racial traumas as well, right? It's pleasing and appeasing the oppressor, whoever that is, within the context of a situation. So I think that fawning can span far greater than children survivors of abuse. But when we're looking at like how that translates into adulthood, it very much can be related. Absolutely. So do you think that there are other populations in which, might experience that?
Yeah, I think so. I think on that broader scope, this is something I'm learning more about. The wider picture here. There's more than just person to person or group to person. It can be the whole family. It can be a whole entire environment.
Absolutely.
And something that I thought about applying mental health to the military. I met many soldiers side by side who treated the military as an escape. I knew people that came from really bad backgrounds that were escaping abuse in their own right, and they end up in a new environment. And I think that it's a great opportunity for them, but also it exposes them to more stress when maybe they're not fully healed themselves. I don't know if you've seen something like that before, but I remember some soldiers that struggled with stress, especially, there's a big authority in the military. Right. It's just part of our structure, and some people don't respond well at all. And I thought, these guys just don't listen. They're not with the program. But come to find out, it's shadows of their past.
Absolutely.
They're remembering abusive parents or caregivers or family members, and I think they would lock up and they would go back to things like that.
It's really interesting that you said that, because like when you really think about it, like for example, like I'm a person myself that struggles with authority figures. I kind of have long-standing history with authority figures, and that really kind of came from my own childhood where like my parents weren't there and I had to basically grow up myself and be my own adult at a very, very young age. So like thinking about it like that and having to care for myself, like I was my authority figure. So nobody could tell me kind of what to do. So like going into the military myself, that was a big struggle for me, and it kind of, you learn to deal with it, but I think it ends up kind of breaking you more in the long run because you don't really learn how to, I guess, really fix it or deal with those kinds of issues until like you're older, and you realize, oh wow, like I'm broken. Like there's things that I need to work on. There's things that I need to fix. And like, I think being in the military makes those things hard because while you're in the military, you're kind of taught to shut off your emotions and just follow, hey, this is what we need to do and this is what you're gonna do. And it's really difficult to kind of navigate through that. But I think that getting out and realizing how, I wouldn't say messed up or anything, because there's nothing wrong with me as a person. It's just things that I'm struggling with. I think that it's really important to kind of take a step back and like really reevaluate yourself at some points, because some people just don't even realize that they're struggling with like trauma. So it was really interesting to think about.
you know,
Absolutely.
and you said that having good connections, one-on-one or one with a group, is really important for dealing with trauma and moving past it. Do you have some ways that we could talk to somebody that we think is experiencing something without, making them uncomfortable or making them feel like we're accusing them or putting them on the spot, like as a concerned friend or family member?
Yeah. How do we engage with someone that we think has something going on or we're concerned with that person? We think about it like universal precautions. How would you engage with anyone that you care about? How would you want someone to engage with you? We don't have to know their story. We don't have to know what they're suffering from. We might not have earned their story yet, but we can engage with them, with dignity, respect, compassion. I think the biggest thing for connection is empathy. And I think as a society, we don't really always know how to practice authentic empathy. I think we're disconnected with all the available technology connections, and it decreases our skills and engagement with other people. So empathy, that's how we do it. That's how we engage with people we think are suffering.
Yeah, I think that's a huge key. And I love that you talked about the change in generations with technology now. And I see that firsthand, where I work. I work in a public school. In gym classes, all I hear is the sound of the ball and sneakers on the floor. I don't hear cheering, and they don't seem to interact with each other the same way. So do you think that's another barrier for people to want to reach out and open up to really get the help that they might need?
Oh yeah, I absolutely think that. And I work with children. I've worked with a lot of children over the years, and kids don't necessarily know how to engage in social connection unless it's modeled for them appropriately and healthy. I say to parents all the time, your kids can see you a lot better than they can hear you. So when you see those kids constantly on devices and checking how many followers they have on Instagram, they're looking for connection. It's just not authentic connection, and they don't know how to name that. So then they'd probably rather connect with someone, on the phone than in person. And what that does is it decreases our capacity to build those skills. The way the brain works is use dependent. So if I was a bodybuilder and I only worked out my legs, my leg muscles are going to be way stronger than the rest of me, right? So brain's the same way. What part are we investing in with our brain? Because it's use dependent.
I like that you kind of brought that up, because while I do agree that devices and technology these days have created a barrier, I also kind of disagree a little bit, because compared to like now and like maybe like 10, 20 years ago, mental health is taken a lot more seriously now than it has been, that I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And I think that is a big, big improvement. And I think it's because so many more young adults and teenagers are really able to recognize what's going on. They might not always be able to have the resources to help them or get help, but I do think that recognizing the trauma or the issues that they have that they need to kind of work on is much more prominent these days.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point that you make. I think that technology has made there's more access because of technology. And I would agree that mental health is now spoken about more over the last several years than historically, but all the research also tells us that there's more mental health concerns now.
Yeah.
So I think maybe both things could be true. I think there are pros and cons with technology, so I don't want to imply that I don't think that technology can be helpful, but what all the research is leading us to believe in what we're seeing is that it decreases other skills while increasing other skills, if that makes sense.
Do you know of any ways that people can positively use that technology for their own benefit? Maybe electronic counseling or any other resources like that you know of?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we're using technology, it's about being intentional. As long as we're not replacing in-person, authentic, empathetic connection, there is benefit to technology, like referencing like telehealth, being able to connect with a support or a person of support through the use of technology, I think can be very beneficial. When we look at how we comfort ourselves as people right now, and when we're reaching out for that connection and support. I think a great way to frame it is, are we looking for comfort or are we looking to numb? And so technology can be used to numb, whether it's intentional, if it's conscious or not. So it's, I think, how we use the technology.
What would be your advice on, let's say, a teenager, maybe 16, 17 years old, that doesn't have good parental guidance? What would you say is advice that you could give to them to help get them the help that they need? Because I feel like a lot of people know that they need therapy or they need counseling and have absolutely no idea how to get any of those resources.
That's a great question as well. So obviously, if it's a child or teenager and they maybe don't have parents that have capacity or awareness or skill to be able to support, utilize resources within schools. That's always a good one. I know Family Counseling, the organization that I work with, we have trauma therapists actually co-located in schools. So we partner with a lot of school districts, and I know that there are mental health services and supports available in the schools. Even if an individual reached out to a counselor and felt they needed maybe something more than what the school could provide, oftentimes the school is going to be able to make referrals to other places. And there are certain situations and circumstances where a minor could engage in therapy even if the caregiver wasn't, actively involved.
Cool.
Yeah.
On that same note right there, talking a little bit about recognizing things. So something I've come to learn over time is that checking in with yourself and taking stock is very important periodically. To just take a minute, think about how things are going, how you feel, and where you want to be. I think goal setting is important. But what would you say are some signs that someone should take a deeper look, that they notice that something in their life is kind of off key, that something needs attention? Are there any indicators that someone can notice within themselves, or maybe cues from other people to help recognize that there's a problem at hand?
Yeah, sure. So I would say, when you say checking in, you mean like checking in with yourself, that self-awareness piece? I think everyone should be constantly taking inventory of, their mental health and how they're doing as it relates to themselves and how they connect with others. If it's difficult to engage in daily tasks, if they're noticing that they're feeling emotions one extreme or another, if they're feeling like, shutting down, if they're finding difficulty engaging with other people, lost interest in things that used to bring them joy, obviously that's always something to be cognizant of. And then that self-talk piece. Are we talking to ourselves the way that we would talk to someone that we care about? And then also the concept of mindfulness, being able to name the emotion that you're feeling in any given moment, but not to over-identify with it. You can experience a feeling and move through it and be okay on the other side. I think those are really important pieces when we're practicing like self-awareness and trying to check in with ourselves. Always connect with someone you trust too, to talk about it.
I like that, because I've been learning myself how it's wrong to kind of tell people that they can't feel that way. So like when they're experiencing those emotions, like it's okay to feel those emotions. It's more about how you react to those emotions and being able to keep yourself in check. And I think that's one of the most difficult things that I think myself going through this process has like kind of dealt with, because it's easy to overreact to the emotions that you're feeling, because sometimes when you are triggered, those emotions, like on the outside, people might think that like what you're reacting to might be this level, but like your emotions are like way up here because that's kind of how you're feeling it.
Yeah.
So I think that it's really good to kind of always remind ourselves that like, hey, it's okay to feel this way, but we need to make sure that we keep ourselves in check as far as how we react to those emotions. Like I shouldn't go out and start punching people or something, I should be able to like, even if I'm angry, I should be able to take a step back and be like, wow, I'm really, really pissed off, but I can keep it together.
Yeah, there's power in the pause.
Yeah. And I think that this is a point that we had talked about previously, is that everybody feels everything differently. And you touched on that just now. But for my context, I had avoided seeking any kind of counseling or anything like that, because I always felt that, oh, well, my issues aren't as important as somebody else's, you know, and it can be difficult to find a therapist or someone that can work with you, especially for specialized needs.
Yeah.
And I'd put it off for so long, and then a friend of mine said, hey, everybody feels everything differently.
Yeah.
How much it matters to you is different than how it could be seen to somebody else. You know, that magnitude and the impact on your life is different. And I thought, wow, that's a big part, you know, and talking about the stigma with seeking, you know, help for trauma or other mental health, you know, I think that's another part of it too. You know, I'm not that bad, or I can figure this out on my own. You know, that might hold some people back. You know, it did for me for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. That resonates with me because I hear that all the time, you know, being a therapist, working with people. It's that idea of comparative suffering. I don't need to go to therapy, or maybe I shouldn't go to therapy because what I experienced wasn't that bad. But at the end of the day, my suffering doesn't minimize your suffering, and vice versa. Suffering is suffering. That impact is real to the individual. And comparing our suffering is kind of silly when you think about it, because there's no scale for that, you know?
So Ashley, I know that there's kind of some people, I know some people that believe that trauma kind of just goes away once you work through it. And I've heard also that trauma never goes away. It just gets better to deal with and handle working through it. So what is your, you know, opinion or kind of experience on that?
As someone that's dedicated, you know, my career to supporting the healing of survivors, I would have to say that I believe that healing is possible. I've seen it. To say that we can experience significant chronic or ongoing traumas and be free of that impact, like, completely, I don't know if many people would say that. I think that it's about integrating the traumatic experience, like integrating our reaction to that experience, how it's impacted us, and integrating that into our daily lives so that we're able to live happy, connected, you know, healthy lives.
Gotcha. Well, this has been really great, Ashley. I appreciate you coming out to talk to us. Hope to see you again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
I learned a lot today from our conversation with Ashley, and I hope that you did too. Continue watching for a list of available resources, and remember to have your own impactful and meaningful conversations with others.